The Japanese soldiers who were stunned by running hot water in American camps. They had been taught that surrender meant shame and that Americans would torture them if captured. But on a frigid morning in December 1942, Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki stood frozen at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, watching in disbelief as steaming water poured endlessly from a metal fixture with just the turn of a handle. In rural Japan, most had known only bucket baths, heated over wood fires. Now in the enemy's prison, they discovered a luxury their own officers rarely enjoyed. As one prisoner confessed in a diary found decades later, "I feel both wonder and shame at how easily I enjoy the comforts provided by those I was trained to hate." What happens when your enemy's kindness becomes more powerful than their weapons? And how did this unexpected comfort create a crisis of identity that would haunt these men long after the war had ended? December 7th, 1941. America is thrust into a global conflict following Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. As the Pacific War erupts, two vastly different cultures collide in ways that will reshape the world. But our story truly begins 1 year later, on December 7th, 1942, in an unexpected place, the snow-covered fields of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, far from the jungle battles of Guadalcanal and the naval clashes of the Coral Sea. A military jeep cuts through the falling snow, carrying a lone Japanese naval officer. His name is Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki, and he carries the weight of an impossible distinction: the first Japanese prisoner of war taken by American forces. Sakamaki had commanded a midget submarine during the Pearl Harbor attack. When his vessel malfunctioned, he washed ashore on an Oahu beach, unconscious but alive. Against all his training, against everything he believed, he had become the unthinkable, a captive of the Americans. Before the war, Japan's military indoctrination was absolute. Surrender was forbidden. The 1941 Japanese military field code stated clearly, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die and leave no ignominious crime behind." This was Bushido, the way of the warrior, reinterpreted for modern warfare. The emperor's soldiers were taught that Americans were barbaric devils who tortured prisoners. Death was preferable to the humiliation of capture. Yet for Sakamaki and the thousands of Japanese soldiers who would eventually join him in American captivity, a profound shock awaited, one that would challenge everything they had been taught about their enemy and about themselves. As Lieutenant Sakamaki was escorted through the processing center at Camp McCoy, he prepared himself for mistreatment, perhaps torture. Instead, he encountered something far more disorienting: humanity, and nothing symbolized this unexpected reality more powerfully than what awaited him at the end of his first day in captivity. Something so simple to Americans, something so shocking to him, something that would become the centerpiece of a hidden story about cultural collision, psychological warfare, and the universal elements of human dignity. December 7th, 1942. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki stands motionless, staring at a metal fixture protruding from the wall of the camp shower room. A young American guard demonstrates with a casual flick of his wrist. Instantly, steaming water cascades forth, filling the room with warmth. "Hot water, whenever you want it," the guard says through an interpreter, seemingly unimpressed by what to him is utterly mundane. But to Sakamaki, this is an astonishing luxury. In rural Japan, bathing often meant heating water bucket by bucket over a wood fire, a labor-intensive process typically performed once a week, if that. Here in captivity, hot water flowed endlessly at the turn of a handle. The interpreter, a Nisei soldier named James Tanaka, later recalled Sakamaki's reaction. He just stood there, his hand under the stream, as if he couldn't believe what he was feeling. When I asked if everything was okay, he simply asked, "This is for prisoners." This disorienting moment, this collision between expectation and reality, would be repeated thousands of times as more Japanese POWs arrived in America. By war's end, approximately 5,400 Japanese soldiers and sailors would find themselves captive on American soil, housed in camps scattered across Wyoming, Wisconsin, Texas, and California. From recently translated diaries, letters intercepted by censors, and declassified intelligence interviews, a consistent theme emerges: the hot water shock. This seemingly trivial amenity represented something profound, the first crack in the foundation of Japanese military indoctrination. Corporal Shigeru Funaki wrote in his diary, discovered decades later, "We were taught Americans were savages who would torture us if captured. Instead, I stand beneath cascading hot water every morning." This small luxury was reserved for officers in the Imperial Army. Here, it is given freely to a prisoner who has brought shame upon himself and his family. This abundance of hot water, so ordinary to Americans, became the unexpected front line in a different kind of battle, a psychological one that would unfold in the most mundane spaces of daily life. For these Japanese soldiers, the comfort offered by their captors presented not relief, but a profound crisis of identity. If Americans were not the barbarians they had been taught to fear, what else might be untrue? And how could they reconcile their training to die, rather than surrender with the unexpected dignity of their captivity? As winter settled over Camp McCoy, Sakamaki and his fellow prisoners would confront questions far more complex than survival, questions about honor, truth, and the possibility that everything they believed about their enemy, and perhaps themselves, had been built on carefully constructed lies. In pre-war Japan, bathing was not merely about cleanliness. It was a cultural institution, a ritual woven into the fabric of daily life. The Japanese ofuro, or traditional bath, was typically a deep wooden tub where families would soak after first washing outside the bath. It was communal, meditative, and strictly regulated by custom and hierarchy. Professor Emiko Onuki-Tierney, cultural anthropologist at the University of Wisconsin, explains, "For the Japanese soldier, bathing rituals reinforced social order. Senior officers bathed first, using the cleanest, hottest water. Junior soldiers came last, often finding only lukewarm water remaining. This hierarchy extended to all comforts of daily life. In American POW camps, this carefully structured world was turned upside down." Camp McCoy's chief of security, Colonel Robert Davis, noted in his 1943 report, "The Japanese prisoners appear bewildered by our shower facilities. They initially refused to use them individually, waiting instead to bathe in groups according to rank. We've observed them collecting water in makeshift containers, attempting to recreate their traditional bathing practices." The collision of these bathing cultures created unexpected tensions. American guards were baffled when Japanese prisoners would clean themselves thoroughly before entering the shower. The Japanese, meanwhile, were horrified by Americans who would step directly into the water without first washing. Sergeant Masaharu Hama wrote in a letter, intercepted by camp censors, "The Americans waste water in ways we cannot comprehend. They stand under running streams for many minutes, letting clean water simply flow away. In my village, such waste would leave families without enough for cooking." This cultural disconnect extended beyond bathing. Many rural Japanese soldiers had grown up in homes without electricity or indoor plumbing. A 1940 Japanese government survey revealed that only 9% of rural households had running water, compared to over 70% of American homes by that same year. Major William Lott, who oversaw several POW facilities, observed, "Many of these men had never seen a flush toilet before captivity. We found some attempting to wash their clothes in them, while others were reluctant to use them at all, preferring to relieve themselves outdoors as they had done in their villages." For American camp administrators, these cultural differences presented practical challenges. But for military intelligence officers, they offered unexpected opportunities. Captain Daniel Goldberg of the Army's Psychological Warfare Division realized that these amenities could serve strategic purposes. In a declassified memo dated March 1943, Goldberg wrote, "The provision of hot water and modern plumbing creates a stark contrast to Japanese military propaganda. Each shower taken becomes a silent rebuttal to the narrative of American barbarism. We recommend maintaining these comforts not merely for humanitarian reasons, but as effective tools for psychological reorientation. For the Japanese prisoners, however, this psychological reorientation came at a profound cost, the unraveling of certainties upon which they had built their entire worldview. By spring 1943, Camp McCoy housed over 200 Japanese prisoners. Among them was Petty Officer Yoshio Tachibana, who had been captured after his destroyer was sunk in the Solomon Islands. Unlike Sakamaki, who had been alone with his thoughts for months, Tachibana arrived to find a community of Japanese prisoners already adapting to captivity. What he discovered disturbed him deeply. In his diary, recovered after the war, Tachibana wrote, "Some men here have embraced American comforts shamelessly. They shower daily, sometimes twice. They speak openly of their good fortune to be captured rather than dying honorably. Have they forgotten who they are? Have they forgotten their duty to the emperor?" This moral crisis divided the Japanese prisoner population. Those who readily accepted American amenities were derisively called comfort soldiers by traditionalists who viewed such adaptation as betrayal. The traditionalists attempted to maintain military discipline and resisted American comforts as a matter of honor. Captain Ichiro Nakamura, a hardline officer captured at Tarawa, organized a faction of resistors. According to camp intelligence reports, Nakamura and his followers would bathe only once weekly, using minimal water and conducting the process with military formality. They established their own internal hierarchy and disciplinary system, punishing those who embraced excessive American comforts. In contrast, a group led by Lieutenant Hideo Matsushita, a university-educated officer from Tokyo, argued that adapting to captivity was neither shameful nor disloyal. In a debate recorded by camp interpreters, Matsushita reportedly said, "If the emperor himself were here, would he not wish us to maintain our health and strength? Is it honorable to refuse cleanliness out of pride? We will serve Japan better by surviving this captivity with dignity." The battle lines within the camps were drawn not with weapons, but with daily choices, to shower or not, to use American toiletries or fashion substitutes from available materials, to embrace comfort or reject it as a matter of principle. For camp administrators, these divisions offered intelligence value. Lieutenant Colonel John Burden, who oversaw Japanese prisoner interrogations, noted, "Those who accept American amenities typically become more forthcoming during questioning. Their willingness to use hot water correlates strongly with willingness to provide useful information." This correlation was not lost on the prisoners themselves. In a rare interview conducted in 1985, former POW Hiroshi Abe recalled, "Those who showered frequently were watched carefully. We suspected they spoke to Americans afterward. The hot water became a symbol. Those who embraced it were seen as embracing the enemy." For many prisoners, the dilemma extended beyond social pressure. It became a deeply personal moral crisis. Naval Lieutenant Toshio Sakai wrote in a letter to his brother, never sent but found in camp records, "Each day I stand before the shower and face a test of my spirit. To feel the warmth is to feel my resolve weaken. Sometimes I turn the water to cold to remind myself of who I am and where my loyalties remain." As 1943 progressed, another factor complicated this internal struggle. News began to filter into the camps about the changing tide of the war, and with it, the realization that Japan might not be the inevitable victor they had been promised. The Japanese military had constructed an elaborate mythology about America, a nation of soft, undisciplined people lacking the spiritual fortitude for extended warfare. Japanese soldiers were taught that Americans lived in decadence but lacked basic necessities, that their infrastructure was crumbling, and that their multiracial society was constantly on the verge of internal collapse. Captain Warren Phillips, head of Camp Translation Services, collected examples of this propaganda from prisoners' personal effects. One military pamphlet issued to Japanese troops stated, "Americans cannot endure hardship. Their homes have many machines, but their spirits are weak. They will surrender quickly when faced with determined Japanese warriors. The reality of American abundance, exemplified by seemingly unlimited hot water, contradicted this narrative in ways impossible to ignore. The prisoners could see with their own eyes the vast industrial capacity that allowed even a remote prison camp to have better amenities than many Japanese officers enjoyed at home. Former intelligence officer Robert Stinnett, who interviewed Japanese POWs during the war, recalled, "When we showed them photographs of American factories producing tanks and planes around the clock, many refused to believe it, but they couldn't deny the evidence of American prosperity they experienced daily." One prisoner told me, "If even your prisoners have hot water whenever they wish, how can Japan win this war?" This growing awareness created dangerous knowledge, information that threatened not just military morale, but the entire ideological foundation of Japanese imperial expansion. If America was not weak and decadent, if its multi-ethnic society could produce such abundance rather than chaos, what did that mean for Japan's divine mission to liberate Asia? In May 1943, camp censors intercepted a letter by Sergeant Kenji Tomita that revealed this creeping doubt. "I believed what we were told about Americans, but I have seen no evidence of their weakness. Instead, I see a country so rich in resources that even enemies are given comforts my family in Osaka never knew." This makes me question what else I have been told that may not be true. This dangerous knowledge spread among prisoners despite efforts by hardcore traditionalists to maintain ideological purity. Camp records show that by mid-1943, factions within the Japanese prisoner population had evolved beyond the initial divide between comfort soldiers and traditionalists. Now a third group emerged, pragmatists who maintained external loyalty to Japan while privately acknowledging the likelihood of Japanese defeat. The arrival of new prisoners throughout 1943 and 1944 brought fresh propaganda narratives that were immediately contradicted by camp realities. Those who had been told American soldiers were starving arrived to find well-stocked kitchens. Those who expected racial discrimination found that Black American guards had the same authority as white ones. And those who had been taught that American infrastructure was failing found camps with reliable electricity, plumbing, and the ever-present hot water. Intelligence Officer Captain Daniel Goldberg documented this phenomenon in his quarterly report. The contrast between expectation and reality creates cognitive dissonance that can be exploited. One prisoner, upon being told America produces 60,000 aircraft annually, laughed in disbelief. When asked why he didn't believe it, he replied, "A country that gives hot baths to prisoners cannot possibly build so many planes." When shown photographic evidence, his entire demeanor changed. As the gap between propaganda and reality widened, the camps became sites of ideological crisis. For men raised in a system that valued certainty and obedience, these contradictions were profoundly destabilizing. Some responded by doubling down on their beliefs, but many began a quiet re-evaluation of everything they had been taught. In October 1943, Camp McCoy security officers made a startling discovery during a routine inspection of the Japanese quarters. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Barracks C was a handwritten newsletter titled Reflection Pool, a clandestine publication circulated among the prisoners. What made this discovery significant wasn't the newsletter's existence, but its contents. The lead article, written anonymously, directly addressed the moral crisis many prisoners felt about the comforts of captivity. Translated by Nisei interpreter Frank Hachiya, it read in part, "We face a test more difficult than battlefield courage. Each day we make choices that define us as Japanese soldiers. When we step into American showers, are we betraying our emperor? When we accept their abundant food, are we weakening our spirit? Some among us say yes. Others argue that we honor Japan by surviving with dignity. This debate tears at the fabric of our community." The newsletter revealed what camp authorities had suspected but couldn't quantify: the psychological warfare effect of American living standards on Japanese military indoctrination. The newsletter continued. Before capture, I believed Americans were devils. Now I bathe in water heated by their generosity. I eat 3 meals each day while my brothers in arms go hungry on distant islands. Is it wrong to acknowledge that our enemy has shown us kindness we did not expect? Is it disloyal to question what we were told about Americans? Colonel James Hanley, the camp commander, recognized the newsletter's intelligence value. Rather than punishing its creators, he ordered the camp staff to allow its continued production while secretly monitoring its content. Over the next 6 months, Reflection Pool published 12 issues, each revealing more about the evolving psychology of the prisoners. By the spring of 1944, the newsletter's tone had shifted from questioning to pragmatic acceptance. One article advised, "We cannot change our circumstances. We can only control our response to them. Use American comforts to strengthen your body and mind. The truly loyal soldier prepares himself to serve Japan after the war, when our homeland will need strong men to rebuild." This shift reflected a broader adaptation occurring among the prisoners. Camp records show that by mid-1944, even the most traditional prisoners had abandoned their resistance to American amenities. The daily shower, once a contested symbol of capitulation, had become routine. Intelligence Officer Lieutenant David Cohen noted in his April 1944 report, "The prisoners no longer debate whether to use hot water, but how to recreate aspects of Japanese bathing culture within American facilities. They have fashioned small stools to sit on while washing before entering the communal shower, maintaining their traditional practice of cleaning outside the bath before soaking." This cultural adaptation represented more than mere accommodation to captivity. It revealed a psychological journey from resistance to resilience, from rejection to reinterpretation. The prisoners were finding ways to maintain their cultural identity while acknowledging a reality that contradicted their training. The most profound evidence of this transformation came in July 1944, when camp censors intercepted a letter from Lieutenant Sakamaki to his family. Having once attempted suicide rather than endure the shame of capture, Sakamaki now wrote, "I have learned that one can be Japanese, truly Japanese, even while living among Americans. Our spirit does not reside in rejecting all things foreign, but in maintaining our inner dignity regardless of circumstances. I bathe each day, grateful for the water's warmth, yet I remain your son, your brother, a servant of our emperor." This evolution in thinking represented a subtle but significant victory in the psychological dimension of the war. Without a single interrogation or propaganda lecture, the simple provision of hot water had accomplished what military intelligence officers called reality orientation, the process by which carefully constructed beliefs collapse when confronted with undeniable contradictory evidence. As news of Allied advances in the Pacific reached the camps throughout 1944, this reality orientation accelerated. The prisoners could no longer maintain faith in Japanese invincibility while simultaneously experiencing American industrial capacity firsthand. The hot water that flowed freely in the Wisconsin winter testified to a resource abundance that Japan simply could not match. On March 10, 1945, American B-29 bombers conducted the deadliest air raid of World War II, dropping incendiary bombs on Tokyo that created a firestorm, killing approximately 100,000 civilians and destroying over 267,000 buildings. News of this devastating attack reached Camp McCoy through official channels 2 days later. Camp Commander Colonel Hanley faced a difficult decision, whether to inform the prisoners about the destruction of Tokyo. After consulting with intelligence officers, he decided that controlled disclosure would serve strategic purposes, demonstrating American power while allowing observation of prisoner reactions. On March 13, 1945, the camp interpreter announced the news during the morning assembly. Camp Security Officer Lieutenant Paul Wilson described the scene in his report. The prisoners received the news in complete silence. No visible reaction for nearly 30 seconds. Then one man collapsed to his knees. Others remained at attention, but many had tears streaming down their faces. Several requested permission to hold a Buddhist service for the dead. Permission was granted. That evening, as the prisoners processed this devastating news, the profound irony of their situation became unbearable for some. Intelligence reports noted increased nighttime movement as prisoners gathered in small groups to discuss the attack. Camp microphones captured fragments of these conversations. One recorded exchange, translated from Japanese, revealed the psychological impact. "My wife's family lived in Asakusa," one prisoner said. "That area is gone now, completely burned. While we stand under hot showers," another replied, "our families search through ashes for water to drink." "How can we accept any comfort now?" a third voice asked. "Each drop of water should burn our skin with shame." The Tokyo firebombing created a new moral crisis for the prisoners. The comforts they had gradually accepted now became symbols of survivors' guilt and disconnection from their suffering homeland. Camp records show that in the week following the news, shower usage dropped by nearly 60%. Some prisoners began refusing regular meals or sleeping on floors instead of beds. This response worried camp medical staff. Dr. Samuel Weinstein, the chief medical officer, noted in his journal, "The news from Tokyo has triggered what appears to be collective grief, manifesting as self-punishment. Several prisoners have developed skin conditions from inadequate hygiene, and malnutrition symptoms are appearing among those refusing meals." In response, camp authorities arranged for Buddhist priest Reverend Nyogen Senzaki, one of the few Japanese religious leaders not interned during the war, to visit from San Francisco. His message to the prisoners, recorded by camp interpreters, offered a different perspective on their dilemma. "Your suffering does not help those who have perished in Tokyo. Your self-denial does not rebuild one home or feed one hungry child. If you wish to honor the dead and serve Japan's future, maintain your health and strength. The water you use here does not deprive anyone in Tokyo. The food you eat does not take from Japan's hungry. But your knowledge, your skills, your living spirit, these will be needed when peace returns." This spiritual counsel, coming from a respected Buddhist teacher, gave many prisoners a framework for reconciling their relative comfort with Japan's increasing devastation. Shower usage gradually returned to previous levels, though now with a different meaning. What had been a simple daily routine became, for many, a somber ritual of reflection. Former prisoner Kazuo Sakamaki, interviewed decades later, recalled, "After we heard about Tokyo, I would stand in the shower and recite the names of my family members, letting the water flow over me as I prayed for their safety. It was no longer about comfort. It was a privilege that carried responsibility. To survive with dignity, to remember, to return home, and help rebuild." As spring turned to summer in 1945, news of further bombing raids reached the camps. The prisoners' response evolved from shock to resignation, and finally to a grim recognition of Japan's impending defeat. Camp intelligence reports noted increasing questions from prisoners about America's post-war plans for Japan, suggesting many had privately accepted the inevitable outcome of the war. August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's recorded surrender announcement, the Yokuon Hoso, or Jewel Voice broadcast, reached American shores via radio transmission. At Camp McCoy, camp authorities gathered the Japanese prisoners in the mess hall to hear a translated version of their emperor's unprecedented address. Camp interpreter James Tanaka later described the scene. "As I read the emperor's words about enduring the unendurable, many men wept openly. Some sat perfectly still as if turned to stone. Others trembled violently. When I finished reading, the silence was absolute. Then one elderly officer stood, bowed deeply toward the east, toward Japan, and said simply, 'It is finished.' The surrender created an immediate transformation in the camp atmosphere. The military discipline that had governed prisoner behavior, even in captivity, dissolved overnight. Camp security noted that factional divisions among prisoners disappeared, and with them, the last vestiges of resistance to American comforts. Lieutenant Colonel John Burden, who had studied Japanese culture extensively before the war, observed, "With the Emperor's surrender, the psychological barrier to accepting American amenities vanished. The prisoners now showered, ate, and utilized camp facilities without the moral conflict that had troubled them before. It was as if permission had finally been granted to acknowledge what many had privately recognized for months, that their quality of life in captivity exceeded what many would face upon returning to a devastated Japan." This recognition created a new anxiety among the prisoners. Camp censors noted a sharp increase in letters expressing concern not about remaining in captivity, but about eventual repatriation. Private Haruki Suzuki wrote to his brother, an Imperial Army officer who had avoided capture, "I fear returning home. Not because of shame, though that remains. I fear what you will think when I tell you how I have lived here. While you fought and starved, I bathed in hot water daily. While our people suffered bombing, I slept in a heated barracks. How can I face you, knowing what comforts I enjoyed while Japan burned?" This fear of homecoming reflected a broader concern, that their experience of America had fundamentally changed them in ways incompatible with post-war Japanese society. They had seen behind the curtain of military propaganda. They had experienced American industrial capacity and standard of living firsthand. They possessed knowledge that contradicted the narrative of Japanese spiritual superiority that had justified the war. Camp psychiatrist Dr. William Spencer documented this phenomenon in his September 1945 report. The prisoners face a unique psychological challenge. They must reconcile three conflicting realities: their pre-capture indoctrination about America, their actual experience in captivity, and now the knowledge that Japan's divine mission has ended in defeat. This cognitive dissonance manifests as anxiety about repatriation and fear of rejection by their home communities. As Allied occupation forces established control over Japan, American authorities began preparing for the repatriation of POWs. This process included debriefing interviews designed to assess the psychological impact of captivity. These previously classified interviews, only declassified in the 1990s, reveal the profound effect of American living standards on Japanese prisoners' worldview. One prisoner, identified only as Sergeant T.K., told his interviewer, "Before capture, I believed Japan was modern and America was corrupt. In captivity, I learned that my village in Hokkaido was decades behind American rural areas. Even your prison camps have better plumbing than my village headman's house. How could we have believed we were superior?" Another prisoner, Lieutenant M.H., expressed a sentiment echoed by many. "I am returning to Japan with dangerous knowledge. I have seen that material comfort does not destroy spiritual strength as we were taught. I have learned that America's diversity is not weakness, but strength. These truths contradict everything our military leaders said. What will happen to Japan if all returned prisoners speak of what we have seen?" This dangerous knowledge concerned American occupation authorities as well, though for different reasons. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters recognized that repatriated POWs could either facilitate or hinder Japan's democratic transformation. A SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, memo dated October 1945 noted, "Former POWs represent a unique demographic who have directly experienced American standards of living and treatment. Their testimony about captivity conditions could significantly influence Japanese public opinion regarding Allied occupation and democratic reforms. Efforts should be made to document their experiences before repatriation and to potentially utilize cooperative individuals in reconstruction education efforts." By December 1945, repatriation of Japanese POWs from American camps was underway. As they prepared to return home, many prisoners received a final shocking revelation. American authorities provided each man with new clothing, a small stipend, and personal hygiene items, including soap and toothbrushes, items that had become scarce in defeated Japan. Camp McCoy's final report noted, many prisoners expressed disbelief upon receiving their repatriation kits. One man asked repeatedly if there had been a mistake, as the quality of the clothing exceeded what he had owned as a civilian. Another wept upon receiving a new pair of shoes, explaining that his family in Osaka would not have seen such leather since before the war. As ships carrying former prisoners departed American ports, they carried more than just men returning home. They transported a living contradiction to Japan's wartime propaganda, men who had experienced America's abundance firsthand and now faced the challenge of reintegrating into a defeated, occupied homeland, struggling with severe shortages of even basic necessities. For most returning Japanese POWs, homecoming was not the joyful reunion they might have imagined. In a society where surrender remained deeply shameful, former prisoners often encountered suspicion, ostracism, and outright hostility. Their dangerous knowledge of American life became a secret many chose to bury rather than share. Historian Ulrich Strauss, who studied the reintegration of Japanese POWs, wrote, most returnees quickly learned to remain silent about their captivity experiences. Those who spoke openly about good treatment or American prosperity were accused of having been converted or brainwashed. In the immediate post-war years, such accusations could damage employment prospects or marriage possibilities. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki, whose hot water encounter opened our story, embodied this silence. Upon returning to Japan, he refused all interviews about his captivity and secured a job with Toyota Motor Corporation, where he worked for decades without ever discussing his unique historical distinction as the first Japanese POW of the war. Only in 1995, 50 years after the war's end, and at the age of 81, did Sakamaki finally break his silence in an interview with the Japan Times. He explained his decades-long reticence. To speak of captivity was to speak of shame. To describe American kindness seemed like betrayal, so I said nothing. But now, as an old man, I can admit that my experience contradicted everything I had been taught. The hot shower I first encountered in Wisconsin symbolized the gap between propaganda and reality. This enforced silence created a curious historical gap. While German POWs returned to Europe with stories that quickly entered public discourse, Japanese former prisoners rarely shared their experiences, even with immediate family. The result was a collective amnesia about this aspect of the war, a hidden history only recently being reconstructed through declassified documents, translated diaries, and late-life interviews with the few surviving former prisoners. Yet despite this public silence, the impact of captivity quietly shaped post-war Japan. Studies by the Japanese Ministry of Reconstruction in the 1950s show that former POWs were significantly more likely to install Western-style bathrooms in their homes than the general population. Many became early adopters of American appliances and plumbing systems during Japan's post-war modernization. More subtly, their exposure to American prosperity influenced Japan's economic recovery. Akio Morita, co-founder of Sony Corporation, noted in his memoir that several key engineers in Sony's early days had been POWs in America. They had seen American consumer technology firsthand, Morita wrote. They returned with a clear vision of what Japanese industry needed to create to compete globally. The hot water shock that had once threatened Japanese military indoctrination became, in peacetime, a catalyst for modernization. Former prisoner Masaru Ibuka, who helped establish Japan's electronics industry, reportedly told colleagues that his first encounter with American plumbing convinced him that Japan's future lay in consumer technology rather than military power. By the 1960s, as Japan experienced its economic miracle, the standard of living that had once shocked Japanese prisoners became a national aspiration. Japanese homes increasingly featured Western-style bathrooms alongside traditional ofuro baths, a physical manifestation of the cultural synthesis that characterized post-war Japan. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, which assessed the psychological impact of the war on Japanese society, noted this unexpected legacy in its 1946 report. Former POWs, though small in number, exert disproportionate influence on Japan's post-war development. Their first-hand experience of American industrial capacity and living standards has made them advocates for economic rather than military approaches to achieving national prosperity. For the approximately 5,400 Japanese soldiers who experienced American captivity, the hot water that once symbolized enemy luxury became, in time, a common feature of their homeland. What had been a source of moral conflict during wartime transformed into a quiet testament to how profoundly their worldview had changed. As historian John Dower observed in his study of occupied Japan, the silent influence of returned POWs represents an overlooked aspect of America's soft power in post-war Japan. While MacArthur's reforms shaped institutions, former prisoners carried personal experiences that contradicted wartime propaganda and suggested alternative paths to national greatness. The most poignant reflection on this transformation comes from former prisoner Shigeru Funaki, who broke his silence in a 1991 memoir published shortly before his death. Describing his first post-war visit to an American-style public bath in Tokyo, Funaki wrote, "As hot water flowed from the tap, I remembered my shock at Camp McCoy in 1943. What had once seemed impossibly luxurious was now commonplace. Perhaps this is the true meaning of peace, that what was once the enemy's luxury becomes everyone's daily comfort." Today, more than 75 years after Japan's surrender, the story of Japanese POWs and their hot water shock offers profound insights into the nature of warfare, cultural collision, and human adaptability. This hidden history reminds us that war is fought not only on battlefields, but in the realm of perception, where mundane realities can challenge the most rigid ideologies. When we trace Lieutenant Sakamaki's journey, from the midget submarine at Pearl Harbor to the shower room at Camp McCoy, to his silent return to a defeated Japan, we witness how the most ordinary comforts can become extraordinary vehicles for understanding across the barriers of conflict. Dr. Emiko Onuki-Tierney, whose anthropological work on Japanese bathing culture has illuminated this history, reflects, "The hot water story reveals how bodily experiences can challenge political indoctrination more effectively than any propaganda. When a soldier feels warmth on his skin that contradicts everything he's been taught about the enemy, transformation becomes possible, not through argument, but through lived experience." This transformation operated beneath the surface of official war narratives. While headlines focused on island battles and kamikaze attacks, this quieter psychological struggle unfolded in camp shower rooms across America. For every Japanese soldier who adjusted the temperature of his shower, a small fissure appeared in the ideological foundation of Imperial Japan. The power of this mundane reality, hot water flowing freely even for prisoners, lay in its indisputability. Propaganda could be dismissed as lies, orders could be questioned as misguided, but the physical sensation of warm water on skin offered a truth beyond words. It was evidence that could not be explained away by military ideology. Frank Gibney, who served as a Japanese language officer and interrogator during the war, later wrote, "The most effective counter to propaganda is not counter-propaganda, but simple, observable reality." No argument about American industrial capacity could match the impact of seeing it demonstrated in something as basic as camp plumbing. This lesson in psychological warfare has not been lost on military strategists in subsequent conflicts. The declassified Camp McCoy reports have been studied at the U.S. Army War College as examples of how humanitarian treatment of prisoners can serve strategic objectives more effectively than harsh interrogation methods. Yet beyond military calculations, this story speaks to something more universally human, the way shared physical comforts can bridge seemingly unbridgeable cultural divides. In the simple act of bathing, enemies discovered common humanity. Reverend Nyogen Senzaki, the Buddhist priest who counseled prisoners after the Tokyo firebombing, expressed this profound truth in a sermon preserved in camp records. Water flows, without concern for politics or nationality. It warms Japanese and American skin alike. In recognizing this shared comfort, we glimpse a world beyond war, where what unites us is more fundamental than what divides us. For the Japanese soldiers who experienced this revelation, the journey from shock to acceptance was neither simple nor painless. It required them to question deeply held beliefs about their enemy, their nation, and themselves. Some resisted until the emperor's surrender removed the psychological barrier. Others embraced the contradiction earlier, finding ways to reconcile their Japanese identity with their new knowledge of America. Their collective experience illuminates the complex moral terrain of captivity, how prisoners navigate between resistance and adaptation, between loyalty to homeland and acceptance of present reality. Their internal struggles remind us that wartime choices are rarely as simple as heroism or collaboration, but exist in the nuanced gray area of human survival. As we revisit this hidden history, we must acknowledge its incompleteness. The enforced silence of returning POWs means many personal experiences were never recorded. The shame associated with captivity buried countless stories that might have enriched our understanding. We glimpse this history through fragments, declassified reports, translated diaries, late-life interviews, knowing much remains forever lost. Yet what survives offers a compelling counter-narrative to traditional war histories. While military accounts focus on strategies and battles, this story reveals how something as simple as plumbing could shape the psychological dimension of conflict. It reminds us that war's most significant transformations sometimes occur not in dramatic moments but in quiet epiphanies during daily routines. The legacy of this hot water shock lived on in post-war Japan's rapid modernization. As Japanese homes installed Western-style bathrooms alongside traditional ofuro baths, they created physical spaces that mirrored the cultural synthesis reshaping their society. Former prisoners who had once questioned whether using American showers betrayed their Japanese identity now helped integrate these technologies into Japan's post-war renaissance. Lieutenant Kazuo Sakamaki's life embodied this transformation. After decades of silence about his captivity, he rose through the ranks at Toyota Motor Corporation, eventually overseeing their expansion into the American market. The man who had once commanded a midget submarine against American forces now helped build Japan's economic relationship with its former enemy. Though he rarely spoke of his POW experience, his career trajectory reflected the broader shift from military confrontation to economic competition that defined Japan's post-war strategy. In his 1995 interview, at the end of his long life, Sakamaki offered perhaps the most fitting epitaph for this hidden history. The war taught Japan many lessons, but perhaps the most important was that true strength lies not in military power, but in creating a society where even the simplest comforts, like hot water, are available to all. This is the quiet revolution I witnessed, from Camp McCoy to modern Japan. Today, as modern Japanese and American bathrooms have largely converged in their technologies while maintaining distinct cultural practices, we find in this mundane convergence a symbol of reconciliation more powerful than political treaties. Former enemies now share not just diplomatic relations but similar daily comforts, a living testament to how far both societies have traveled from the deadly certainties that once drove them to war. As the last witnesses to this history fade away, their stories remind us that peace is built not only through grand diplomatic gestures, but through countless small recognitions of shared humanity. In the flow of hot water across cultural boundaries, we glimpse the possibility of connection even across the deepest divides of conflict. Perhaps there is no better symbol of war's ultimate futility than this, that what was once an enemy luxury inspiring moral crisis in Japanese prisoners, eventually became an ordinary comfort in homes across Japan. The hot water that once divided now unites, flowing impartially, warming without distinction, offering its simple comfort to former enemies and allies alike. In this transformation, from shock to crisis to acceptance to integration, we find a path from war to peace more honest than any victory narrative. It acknowledges the painful unlearning required of former enemies, the quiet accommodations that make reconciliation possible, and the shared human needs that ultimately transcend national boundaries. As we close this examination of a nearly forgotten chapter of World War II, we are left with a profound appreciation for how the most mundane comforts can become vehicles for understanding. In the simple flow of hot water, enemies discovered not just physical warmth, but the possibility of a shared future beyond the divisions of war.